There's a kind of exhaustion that almost nobody talks about. Not physical exhaustion. Not the kind you fix with a vacation or a full night of sleep. This kind goes deeper. You're not sick. You're not lazy. Nothing dramatic has happened in your life. From the outside, everything probably looks normal, but somewhere inside, you feel finished. Finished with constantly giving your energy away. Finished with trying to explain yourself. Finished with walking into rooms and pretending you don't notice what everyone else seems determined to ignore. You wake up one day and realize you're just tired, not sleepy, soul tired, and maybe the hardest part is that you can't even fully explain why. If that feeling sounds familiar, then what I'm about to tell you might completely change the way you understand yourself. Because according to Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists in modern history, this exhaustion is not a flaw, it's not weakness, and it's definitely not proof that there's something wrong with you. In many cases, it's actually the result of a very specific psychological gift being used in the wrong direction for far too long. And once you understand what that gift really is, everything starts to make sense. Jung spent decades listening to people who carried this exact feeling. People who were emotionally drained in ways they couldn't describe. People who felt overwhelmed by life, even when nothing bad enough had happened to justify it. People who constantly felt misunderstood, disconnected, exhausted by relationships, exhausted by social situations, exhausted by pretending. Again and again, he noticed something interesting. These weren't weak people. In fact, many of them were extraordinarily perceptive. They noticed things other people missed. They sensed emotional tension instantly. They could walk into a room and feel when something was off, even if everyone was smiling. They could hear sadness hidden behind jokes. They could sense resentment underneath politeness. And they often spent their entire lives being told they were too sensitive for noticing it. Jung believed that most human behavior is controlled not by conscious thought, but by unconscious forces, invisible emotional patterns, buried fears, unspoken tension, things people don't openly admit, but still communicate constantly through tone, body language, silence, energy, contradiction. He called this hidden layer the unconscious. And according to Jung, some people are naturally far more attuned to it than others. Most people interact mainly with the surface of life. The words people say, the image they present, the version of reality everyone agrees to act out. But highly perceptive people experience something deeper. They don't just hear what's said, they feel what's unsaid, and that changes everything. Imagine talking to someone who says they're fine, but every instinct in your body tells you they're not. Or sitting in a family dinner where everyone is smiling, but you can feel tension hanging in the air like smoke. Or meeting someone new and immediately sensing something dishonest underneath their confidence, even though you can't explain exactly why. For many people, this sounds strange. But for highly sensitive and intuitive individuals, this is daily life. They don't choose to notice these things. They just do. Jung called this differentiated intuitive perception, a natural sensitivity to unconscious emotional information. And he believed people with this trait experience reality in a fundamentally different way than most of the population. Here's the problem. When you grow up perceiving life this way, the world usually teaches you not to trust yourself. Think about childhood for a moment. You're young, and you can already feel things other people pretend aren't there. You sense your parents are unhappy even though they insist everything is fine. You notice the tension in the house. You notice when someone is hurting. You notice who's pretending. You notice who's afraid. And when you try to talk about it, what do you hear? You're imagining things. You're too emotional. You're overthinking. Stop being so sensitive. So eventually, you learn. You learn to stay quiet. You learn to suppress your instincts. You learn to doubt your own perception. And slowly, over time, you develop one of the most exhausting habits a human being can develop. You begin constantly monitoring yourself. To avoid making other people uncomfortable, Jung saw this pattern over and over again in his patients. People who had been trained to distrust the very thing that was most accurate about them, their perception. And according to Jung, this creates a dangerous split inside the personality. Because when you stop trusting your perception, you stop trusting yourself. Now here's where things become even more painful. Highly perceptive people don't just notice more, they care more, and that combination can become psychologically devastating, because these individuals often turn into emotional caretakers for everyone around them. In their families, they become the peacekeepers, the ones who sense stress before anyone says a word, the ones who adjust themselves emotionally to avoid conflict, the ones quietly carrying the emotional atmosphere of the entire household. In friendships, they become the listener, the dependable one, the person everyone unloads onto. In relationships, they become hyper-attuned to their partner's emotions, anticipating needs, trying to fix problems before they happen, blaming themselves whenever something goes wrong, and at work, they often become unofficial emotional managers. Reading the room, managing tension, handling difficult personalities, absorbing stress nobody even realizes they're carrying. Sound familiar? Jung noticed something tragic about this pattern. These people were using their greatest strength against themselves, because when all your attention goes outward, you lose connection with your own inner world. You become so focused on everyone else's emotional reality that you stop asking basic questions like, what do I need? What am I feeling? What is this situation doing to me? And because your empathy is real, people begin taking from you endlessly, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unconsciously. But either way, the result is the same. You become emotionally exhausted, not because you're weak, but because you've been carrying far more than your own emotional weight for years. Jung described this as one of the most psychologically dangerous positions a person can occupy, because your gift becomes your wound. The very thing that makes you perceptive, compassionate, emotionally intelligent, also makes you vulnerable to manipulation, emotional burnout, and self-abandonment. But here's the part most people don't realize. Highly perceptive people are usually not blind to what's happening. In fact, they often see everything. That's what makes it so painful. Jung noticed that these individuals were constantly gathering accurate information about the people around them. They noticed inconsistencies, contradictions, shifts in tone, behavior that didn't match words. They sensed lies long before they had proof. They tracked patterns unconsciously over months and years, and yet they ignored their own conclusions. Why? Because they had been trained not to trust themselves, so instead of acting on what they saw, they explained it away. Maybe you've done this yourself. You sensed someone was dishonest, but told yourself you were overreacting. You noticed emotional manipulation, but convinced yourself you were being unfair. You felt a relationship draining you, but stayed anyway because you didn't want to hurt the other person. This is one of the deepest psychological traps highly sensitive people fall into. They perceive clearly, but they override their own perception in order to preserve connection. And then, eventually, something breaks. Jung documented this repeatedly. A betrayal, a moment too obvious to deny, a lie too big to rationalize, a cruelty too direct to explain away, and suddenly the person can no longer keep choosing comfort over truth. Now, Most people assume that when highly emotional individuals reach this point, they collapse. They expect chaos, explosive reactions, emotional breakdowns, but Jung noticed something completely different. The person became calm, deeply calm, almost frighteningly calm, not numb, not dissociated, clear, like someone who had finally stopped fighting reality, because in that moment, everything they had sensed for years became confirmed. Every intuition, every red flag, every quiet warning inside them. They realized something life-changing. I was right, and for the first time in their lives, they believed themselves. That moment changes people forever, because once you stop doubting your own perception, you become impossible to manipulate in the same way again. And according to Jung, this is where true psychological transformation begins. Jung observed something else that most people never realize until much later in life. The more perceptive a person becomes, the more lonely they often feel in the beginning. Not because they are incapable of connection, not because they are antisocial, and not because there is something fundamentally wrong with them, but because once you begin seeing people clearly, it becomes impossible to participate in relationships the same way you once did. You start noticing how many conversations are built on performance instead of honesty. How many friendships survive only because nobody says what they truly feel. How many families maintain peace by avoiding truth entirely. And for someone with heightened perception, pretending eventually becomes exhausting. Jung wrote that one of the most painful phases of individuation is the period where a person begins separating from false forms of connection before they have fully discovered authentic ones. This creates a strange psychological space. You no longer fit into your old relationships comfortably, but you have not yet found your new life either. So you exist in between worlds, and this in-between stage can feel terrifying. Many people experience it as isolation. Others experience it as emotional numbness. Some begin wondering if they are becoming cold or disconnected from humanity altogether. But Jung insisted this stage is not regression. It is transition. Because before you can build authentic connection, you first have to stop participating in false connection. And for highly perceptive people, this often means learning one of the hardest lessons imaginable. Not everyone deserves access to you. That sentence alone changes everything once you truly understand it. Because many emotionally sensitive people grow up believing love means endless availability, that kindness means tolerance, that empathy means self-sacrifice, that being understanding means accepting behavior that slowly destroys your peace. Jung rejected this completely. He believed mature love requires differentiation, meaning two whole, people standing side by side without consuming each other's identities. Not rescue, not emotional dependency, not one person abandoning themselves in order to maintain connection with another. Real connection requires truth, and truth requires boundaries. This is why so many highly perceptive people feel exhausted in relationships. They were never taught boundaries as acts of self-respect. They were taught boundaries were selfish. So instead of asking, "Is this relationship healthy for me?" they ask, "How much discomfort can I tolerate before leaving?" And those are completely different questions. Jung saw over and over again that emotionally perceptive people often stay too long in damaging environments because they can understand the pain behind harmful behavior. They see the wounded child behind the angry adult. They understand the trauma beneath the manipulation. They recognize the insecurity underneath arrogance. And because they can understand it, they excuse it. But understanding someone's pain does not obligate you to tolerate behavior that harms you. That distinction is one of the most important psychological boundaries a person can ever learn. You can have compassion for someone and still walk away. You can understand someone deeply and still refuse access to your life. You can love someone and still decide they are not safe for your nervous system. Jung believed this realization marks the beginning of true adulthood. Not biological adulthood, psychological adulthood. The moment you stop abandoning yourself in order to preserve relationships that require your self-betrayal to survive. And once this shift begins happening, something remarkable occurs. Your energy starts returning. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but then more noticeably over time, because exhaustion is not always caused by doing too much. Sometimes it is caused by suppressing too much. Suppressing your instincts, suppressing your anger, suppressing your truth, suppressing your perception, suppressing the constant awareness that something around you feels wrong while pretending everything is fine. That level of self-suppression burns enormous psychological energy. Jung compared it to trying to hold a beach ball underwater indefinitely. Eventually, the effort itself becomes unsustainable. This is why so many sensitive people feel exhausted even when their lives appear normal from the outside. Their nervous systems are overloaded not only by what they perceive externally, but by the endless internal labor of pretending not to perceive it. And once they stop doing that, once they stop fighting themselves constantly, their entire relationship with life begins changing. Jung documented patients who, after years of emotional exhaustion, suddenly began experiencing moments of extraordinary clarity once they started trusting their own perception again. Not dramatic mystical experiences, simple clarity. They began recognizing immediately when a situation felt psychologically unsafe. They stopped needing endless external validation before making decisions. They became more selective about where they invested their emotional energy. They noticed how much calmer their bodies felt around emotionally honest people. And perhaps most importantly, they stopped chasing relationships that required them to shrink themselves in order to maintain harmony. That last one changes everything. Because many highly perceptive people spend years unconsciously making themselves smaller so others can remain comfortable. They soften their observations. They silence their intuition. They downplay what they know. They suppress their emotional intensity. Not because they are weak, but because they learned early in life that authenticity threatened belonging. And for a human being, belonging is survival. So they adapt. But adaptation becomes dangerous when it disconnects you from yourself. Jung believed, neurosis often develops precisely at the point where a person can no longer tolerate the distance between who they truly are and who they have trained themselves to be. That internal split eventually creates suffering, and the suffering is not meaningless. Jung believed psychological pain is often the psyche's attempt to force growth. An alarm system, a signal, a demand for integration, meaning the exhaustion you feel may not actually be evidence that you are failing at life. It may be evidence that the false version of yourself can no longer survive. That is a completely different interpretation, and it changes the entire emotional landscape. Because instead of asking, "Why am I so exhausted?" you begin asking, "What inside me am I no longer willing to betray?" That question leads somewhere powerful. Jung noticed that once highly perceptive people stop using all their energy managing everyone else's emotional reality, they often discover abilities that had been buried underneath survival mode for years. Creativity returns, curiosity returns, motivation returns, joy returns. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because their psychological energy is finally being used in alignment with themselves instead of against themselves. And this alignment creates a kind of quiet power that other people immediately notice. Not loud power, not dominance, not charisma in the traditional sense. Something calmer. A person who trusts themselves fully moves differently through the world. They do not chase validation constantly. They do not over-explain every decision. They do not panic when misunderstood. They do not collapse every time someone disapproves of them, because they are no longer outsourcing authority over their inner reality. Jung believed this was one of the clearest signs that individuation was truly occurring. The person becomes internally anchored. And once that happens, manipulation stops working the same way it used to. Gaslighting stops working the same way it used to. Emotional guilt stops working the same way it used to. Psychological games stop working the same way they used to. Because the integrated person no longer abandons their own perception in order to preserve external approval. That is freedom, not freedom from pain, not freedom from conflict, not freedom from disappointment, freedom from internal division, freedom from constantly fighting yourself. And according to Jung, that freedom is one of the highest psychological achievements a human being can reach. But he also warned about something important here. Integration does not mean becoming emotionally invulnerable. You will still feel deeply. You will still care deeply. You will still hurt sometimes. The difference is that pain will no longer erase your sense of self. You will no longer confuse empathy with self-erasure. You will no longer interpret self-protection as cruelty. You will no longer believe that loving people requires abandoning yourself completely. And once that shift happens, your relationships begin changing in profound ways. Some relationships end, others deepen. Some people disappear because they only benefited from the version of you that lacked boundaries. Others suddenly become closer because they finally meet the real you instead of the edited version. This process can feel brutal at first. Jung never romanticized transformation. He knew real psychological growth often dismantles large parts of a person's previous life. But he also believed something extraordinary waits on the other side of that dismantling. A life that actually belongs to you. Not a life organized around other people's expectations. Not a life built around emotional survival. Not a life constructed entirely to avoid conflict or rejection. Your life. And for many highly perceptive people, this is the first time they truly begin living instead of merely adapting. Jung believed that every human being eventually arrives at a moment where continuing to live unconsciously becomes more painful than change itself. For some people, that moment comes through heartbreak. For others, through burnout. For others, through betrayal, illness, loneliness, anxiety, or a strange emptiness they cannot explain. But whatever form it takes, the purpose underneath it is often the same. The psyche is demanding truth, not surface-level truth, not intellectual truth, existential truth, the kind that forces you to ask questions you have spent years avoiding. Who am I when I stop performing for everyone else? What do I actually feel beneath all this emotional noise? Which parts of my life are real, and which parts exist only because I was afraid to disappoint people? What would happen if I trusted my own perception completely? Jung believed those questions are not signs that you are falling apart. They are signs that your deeper self is trying to emerge. And the people who experience this process most intensely are often the ones who have spent the longest disconnecting from themselves in order to survive socially. Think about how much energy that requires. Monitoring every word before you speak. Analyzing everyone's emotional state before expressing your own. Suppressing instincts that make other people uncomfortable. Pretending not to notice tension. Pretending not to see dishonesty. Pretending not to feel hurt. Pretending not to need rest. At some point, the nervous system simply cannot carry that burden anymore. And this is why so many highly perceptive people suddenly reach a stage in life where they no longer have patience for superficiality. It is not arrogance. It is not bitterness. It is exhaustion, a deep exhaustion, with everything false. Jung noticed that once people begin individuating seriously, their tolerance for emotional dishonesty decreases dramatically, not because they become judgmental, but because they finally understand the psychological cost of self-betrayal. They know what it did to them, and they can no longer participate in it unconsciously. This is why some relationships become impossible to maintain after psychological awakening. Not because anyone became evil overnight, but because one person stopped pretending. And once pretending ends, every relationship built on performance begins shaking immediately. Jung said something remarkable about this stage. He believed many people mistake awakening for depression at first, because the old pleasures stop working before the new meaning arrives. The distractions lose their power, the performances feel empty, the social masks become exhausting, but the new life has not fully formed yet either. So the person feels suspended between identities, no longer who they were, not yet who they are becoming. And psychologically, that space can feel terrifying. But Jung insisted it is sacred, because transformation always requires a symbolic death before rebirth becomes possible. The false self has to collapse. The version of you built entirely around adaptation, approval, fear, survival, and emotional self-erasure cannot accompany you into wholeness. Something new must emerge, and emergence takes time. This is where many people turn back, because growth initially feels less stable than dysfunction. At least, dysfunction is familiar. Even painful patterns can feel psychologically safe, simply because they are known. Jung saw patients repeatedly return to relationships, environments, and identities that were hurting them because uncertainty felt more frightening than suffering. And this is why courage is such an essential part of individuation. Not dramatic courage. Quiet courage. The courage to trust yourself when nobody else understands you. The courage to disappoint people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. The courage to stop apologizing for what you accurately perceive. The courage to walk away from environments that require your self-abandonment in order to function. Most importantly, the courage to become visible, because many highly perceptive people unconsciously spend years hiding, not physically, psychologically. They hide their intelligence to avoid intimidating others. They hide their sensitivity to avoid ridicule. They hide their insight to avoid conflict. They hide their needs to avoid rejection. They hide their exhaustion because they fear being seen as weak. Over time, this creates a devastating internal contradiction. They desperately want to be loved, but they are rarely showing the world their real selves. And Jung believed this is one of the deepest sources of loneliness a person can experience. Being emotionally surrounded while psychologically unseen. Eventually, the psyche reaches a breaking point. The soul wants authenticity more than approval. And once that happens, everything changes. The person starts speaking more honestly, not aggressively, simply honestly. They stop forcing connection where no real connection exists. They stop volunteering for emotional labor nobody appreciates. They stop chasing people who only value them when they are endlessly available. They stop shrinking themselves to fit spaces they have already outgrown psychologically. At first, this can feel selfish, especially for people conditioned to equate self-sacrifice with love. But Jung argued the opposite. He believed chronic self-abandonment is not love. It is fear disguised as morality. Real love requires presence, and you cannot be fully present in your life if you are constantly disappearing inside everyone else's expectations. This is why integrated people often appear calmer, not because they suffer less, but because they are no longer internally divided. Their energy is no longer being consumed by endless self-negotiation. Should I say what I really think? Should I ignore what I clearly feel? Am I overreacting? Am I imagining this? Do I have the right to feel hurt? Do I have the right to leave? Integration quiets that internal war. And when the war quiets, clarity emerges. Jung described this clarity almost like a return to instinct. The person begins sensing immediately what nourishes them and what depletes them, which environments support psychological health and which ones poison it slowly, which relationships are reciprocal and which ones are extractive. And once you see those patterns clearly, you cannot unsee them. This is why psychologically integrated people often become extremely selective with their energy, not because they hate people, because they finally understand the value of peace. They understand that attention is life force, emotional energy is life force, and where you place it determines the shape of your existence. Jung believed modern society trains people to disconnect from this wisdom constantly. We are rewarded for overextending ourselves, rewarded for emotional self-neglect, rewarded for productivity at the expense of inner life, rewarded for performance instead of authenticity. And then people wonder why they feel empty. The psyche was never designed to survive permanent self-betrayal. Eventually, something inside rebels. That rebellion often appears first as exhaustion, but beneath the exhaustion is intelligence. Your mind and body may be trying to tell you something your conscious identity has refused to acknowledge. That the life you are living no longer matches the truth inside you. Jung believed symptoms often contain messages. Anxiety can be a message. Burnout can be a message. Depression can be a message. Emotional numbness can be a message, not meaningless suffering. Communication from the unconscious, and the task is not simply to silence the symptoms as quickly as possible. The task is to understand what they are trying to say, because once the message is heard clearly, transformation becomes possible. Jung spent his entire career guiding people toward this realization, not toward perfection, not toward constant happiness, toward wholeness. And wholeness, according to Jung, does not mean eliminating your sensitivity. It means learning how to stand inside it without drowning, learning how to care deeply without absorbing everything, learning how to remain open without becoming defenseless, learning how to love without abandoning yourself, learning how to trust your perception without needing universal agreement from others first. This is what psychological maturity actually looks like. Not hardness, integration. The integrated person is not cold. They are clear, they are compassionate, but no longer self-erasing, open-hearted but no longer naive, empathic but no longer available for emotional exploitation. Jung believed this type of person becomes stabilizing for everyone around them, because people feel safety in someone who is internally anchored, someone who is honest without cruelty, boundaried without aggression, sensitive without fragility, strong without domination. That kind of presence changes rooms quietly. And perhaps this is why Jung believed highly perceptive people matter so much psychologically. Not because they are superior to others, but because once integrated, they help reconnect humanity to emotional truth. They remind people that intuition matters, that inner life matters, that authenticity matters, that psychological honesty matters. And in a world built increasingly around distraction, performance, and emotional disconnection, that reminder becomes incredibly important. So if you recognize yourself in these patterns, if you have spent your life feeling too sensitive, too aware, too emotionally exhausted by everything around you, Jung's work offers a very different interpretation of your experience. Maybe your exhaustion was never proof that you were weak. Maybe it was proof that your psyche could no longer tolerate living against itself. Maybe the loneliness was not punishment. Maybe it was preparation. Maybe the collapse you feared is actually the beginning of integration. And maybe the sensitivity you spent your whole life trying to suppress is not the obstacle standing between you and your life's purpose. Maybe it is the path itself. Jung Bell.